So we're very pleased to have with us today Achim Steiner, the administrator of UNDP, and David Gressley, the resident and humanitarian coordinator for Yemen. Mr. Steiner, first, over to you.
Thank you, Farhan. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And before commenting on today's news related to the FSO Safer, let me join the Secretary General and my colleague David also in warmly welcoming the release of our colleagues. As one of you noted, 18 months is a horrendously long period of time. We all were extremely concerned, and we are now extremely relieved that they have been released. And I simply wanted to join both of them in welcoming this development. Now, out of Yemen, obviously today seems to be a good news day, which many have not expected, perhaps for a while. But as I speak to you at 6 p.m. local time, the pumps were turned off on the FSO Safer. The pumping of over 1 million barrels of oil from the FSO Safer onto the replacement tanker has been accomplished. And with that, I think we have reached a milestone in perhaps one of the most significant preventative actions taken in recent years. Many of you have followed this story. You know that the potential impacts and consequences of a catastrophic oil spill from the FSO Safer would have affected hundreds of thousands of Yemenis immediately, destroyed their fisheries, possibly up to a quarter of a century, affected one of the main shipping routes in the world leading up to the Suez Canal, not to mention the economies of neighbouring states. So as the United Nations family, and joining my colleagues, the Secretary General, David, and many who today have, in a sense, sighed a sign of relief at this particular juncture, I join them with a deep sense of gratitude and relief. We, I think, have against many odds managed to complete an operation that many had talked about for years. Many were concerned could not really be done. Many questioned why it took the UN long to be able to implement it. And no doubt with the operation now being completed, the attention will move to questioning whether all problems have been solved concerning the oil that was on the FSO Safer. Let me simply say that what we are reporting to the world today is three things. First of all, when the world turned to the United Nations, there was no one else who was ready or prepared to mount such an operation, unprecedented in the midst of a conflict zone involving the purchase of a very large crude carrier and oil tanker, recruiting and retaining the services of a global salvage company, of a crew of experts, technicians, chemists, oil spill specialists, as well as a consortium of insurance experts and many others, including in our UN family. And I want to pay particular credit here to our colleagues in the International Maritime Organization, the World Food Programme, UNDP, and others, who through their expertise in logistics also very much contributed to an operation that was led by our resident coordinator, David Gressley, and which the Secretary General then requested UNDP to take responsibility for the operational implementation. Colleagues, at every juncture of this journey of almost 2 years, many challenges were faced. Many things could have gone wrong. We struggled to find the funding. We struggled to find the tanker on the global marketplace in which such vessels were not available. An unprecedented negotiation with insurance underwriters lasting months had to be conducted to enable this operation to be mounted. We spent months negotiating with Smith, the central partner in this salvage operation, to figure out a way in which they could deploy their vessels, their teams, their crew in a conflict zone. We had, in the end, to charter also an aircraft that was on standby loaded with chemicals for aerial dispersal should an oil leak or a spill occur during the ship-to-ship transfer operation. With the dedication and the professionalism of our colleagues in the UN, but also our partners, the contractors, but also governments that in the end provided the critical pledges that allowed us to proceed with the financing to mount this operation, I think today we stand before the world with a deep sense of gratitude, but also a very simple and powerful message. When diplomacy and the convening power of the UN come together with its technical expertise, its operational capacity, and a world that is willing to cooperate, even in a most challenging operating environment in the midst of a conflict zone, remarkable things become possible. Many thought this was impossible, an impossible salvage operation. I think today we report to you with a sense of satisfaction, but also with humility, because this is what the UN very often accomplishes every day across the world. And I was struck a few days ago when a journalist asked me, you know, if you succeed, do you think people will remember this? And I said, look, if we fail, they will remember it for generations, as people do with the Exxon Valdez. If we succeed, people will very quickly forget that an extraordinary disaster was actually prevented. Some of you have written and called the FSO Safer a ticking time bomb. I think it is fair to say that as of today, that ticking is no longer an immediate threat. But we are very conscious of the fact that this operation is not over. We are committed as part of the agreement to deliver a convoy. In the next week to 10 days, the cleaning of the tanks will still continue in situ. And then our objective will be to tow the Safer to a port for a final cleaning, and then to commission a scrapping and recycling operation that will finally allow the FSO Safer to no longer be, even in its own physical presence, a threat or liability. So with that, Karan, I hand over to David Gressley, who has in many ways the great privilege today of having two remarkably good news stories coming out of Yemen. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's true. Mr. Gressley is the source of all of our good news for today. So with that, Mr. Gressley, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Farhan, and thank you very, very much, Achim, for those excellent remarks and reflections. As was mentioned, I just arrived in Aden a few hours ago, about 3 hours ago, in fact, on a flight from the city of Mukalla with the 4 Yemeni staff members who have been held hostage for the last 18 months. We're very delighted with this news. It's great news for our team here in Aden and more broadly in the southern part of the country. As you recall, we had a World Food Program member assassinated here about 3 weeks ago. So it is good to have a good news day as we have today. So it's a welcome day for the families. It's a welcome day for the UN personnel throughout Yemen. I'm pleased to report, as was mentioned in the opening, that they are unharmed, in good health and good spirits. I had a chance to speak with them, obviously, on the way back. I'm very much impressed by not only their good spirits, but the strength that they have exhibited under extraordinary circumstances. In addition, of course, we have our Bangladeshi colleague, Mr. Achim, who also has been released, and we celebrate for all of the families their release and reunion with their families. So as everyone has said, it's been a good day in Yemen. They don't come every day. So we're very pleased that we can share this news today. And today we can say that the United Nations and a remarkably broad group of partners have succeeded in preventing the worst case scenario of a catastrophic oil spill in the Red Sea. Over the past 18 days, Smith Salvage has pumped as much oil as possible from the FSO Safer to the MT Yemen, formerly known as the Nautica. More than 98% of the estimated 1.14 million barrels are now safely stored on the Yemen. The residual oil on the Safer is mixed with sediment and can't be pumped out at this point. It will be removed during the final cleaning of the Safer. An enormous amount of political groundwork, fundraising, and project planning over the past 2 years has brought us to this point. I want to congratulate the United Nations Development Program under Achim's leadership for its outstanding work in implementing the project, which included considerable financial risk. It's been mentioned earlier that only the UN was in a position to do this. I have to say the UN Development Program was the agency that stepped forward to do this, and I want to congratulate them for that work. We should recognize the cooperation the United Nations received from the authorities in Sana'a, particularly through the Safer Technical Committee, currently based in Hodeidah, which ensured the access, security, and technical support required to carry this out. The crew of the Safer played a critical role in carrying out the operation, and they continue to work very closely with the Smith team. I'd like to highlight that two former captains that are working on the Safer actually came from Aden and were invited up from Aden to work on the project here. An indication of the importance of going beyond the day-to-day concerns that exist on the civil war that continues here. The United Nations also received important political and technical support from the government of Yemen that cannot be underestimated. It also made a $5 million contribution to the Global Environmental Facility, making it one of the top 10 donors to the project. The United Nations has raised more than $121 million from 23 member states and the European Union, as well as the private sector and the global public. We still need about $20 million to finish the work we've started. Bridging funding from OCHA provided the necessary liquidity UNDP needed to get us to this point. We continue to seek support from donors to reimburse OCHA, which I should add has been a leading advocate for the Safer problem over many, many years. The broad coalition working to prevent the catastrophe also includes countless individuals and organizations that provided invaluable expertise and in-kind support. It includes private companies like the Faham Group that proposed the initiative that was the basis for the UN plan. Member states contributed in many different ways. Djibouti has been an incredible host as a key hub for the operation. Both the Nautica, now the MT Yemen, and the Endeavour anchored in Djibouti before sailing to Yemen. Egypt's Suez Canal Authority waived fees for the passage of the Endeavour on its way back, to the operation. These are just some of the many examples that show the breadth of support, which reflect the well-placed concern the world has had for the threat posed by the Safer. Of course, the entire UN system has been engaged, and I want to thank, in particular, Secretary General for his support. So a remarkable global coalition has come together under the UN umbrella to prevent an environmental, humanitarian, and economic catastrophe that would have happened if the world had not acted. But we still need to finish the work the UN has started, as outlined by Achim earlier. The installation of a convoy is the next critical step. It needs to be tethered to a specialized buoy. And then, of course, the final removal of the Safer and the final cleaning of the Safer will be required to permanently eliminate the threat. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I'll turn the floor over to questions. First question goes to Edith Lederer.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing, my name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. First, Mr. Gressly, on the 5 UN staff who were released, can you confirm that they were held by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? And could you give us some information on the conditions that they were held under? And you said you flew back to Aden with the 4 Yemenis. What happened to the Bangladeshi UN staffer? Where is he and what condition is he in? And then I have some follow-ups on the Safer tanker. Thanks.
Should I go ahead and answer those questions?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I can confirm that the hostage takers were Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So this is a threat that remains here in Yemen and remains actually an increasing threat, their activities as we speak. In terms of their conditions, as I mentioned, they're in good health, good spirits, despite everything that they went through. But they went through a very difficult period of 18 months of isolation. They're extremely pleased to be back here in Aden. Some will continue on to Sana'a, where their homes are as well. And I will, of course, accompany them to that location. I don't want to go into the details. I think now is the time for us simply to celebrate their return, to give them time to get back with their families. There's a lot that will have to be processed in the days and weeks to come with them. This is a very difficult situation for anybody to live through, but they seem to have come through in remarkable condition. Likewise, for our Bangladeshi colleague who is now in Bangladesh, he's been he returned home as well on separate flights going back home to Bangladesh. So he's safely home as well. Thank you.
Just one quick follow-up. Was the UN itself involved in direct negotiations with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula?
These kinds of negotiations are quite sensitive and often complex. At this point, I'm not going to comment any further on that, except that these were long-lasting efforts that were made with multiple partners to try to find a way to get these staff members released. Thank you.
Okay. On the Safer tanker, you said that the tanker itself is going to be cleaned where it is now first and then taken to another port and cleaned again? And what kind of a time frame are you talking about? And what's going to happen to the renamed tanker with the oil? Thank you.
Yeah, so in fact, the cleaning will take place in two phases. There'll be an initial phase that's starting now, since the pumping is now over. The last phase of the pumping actually was called oil stripping, which is to take the last bits of oil off the walls and other locations, try to extract as much of the liquid oil as possible. Now we're dealing with oil that's mixed with sediment, as I mentioned. And so there will be a seawater wash that's going on over the next few days, and then a demobilization of the Endeavour, the salvage vessel, which will then depart. It's not totally clean at that point because of the bottom level sediment that the sea washing will not be able to take care of. There'll be a demucking process that cannot be fully carried out locally. And so that will have to be done in another port. We're working out the details now on that, and we'll be able to come forward with more information on timelines to implement that particular phase as that becomes available. In terms of the MT Yemen, it will continue to hold the oil. It's designed, you mentioned the word most, that's like an FSO, only it's a tethered FSO. That's what most stands for, a moored offshore storage tanker. And so it will carry out its functions as an offshore storage tanker, holding the oil until at some point, which we all expect will happen, that there can be an appropriate disposal of the oil sold for appropriate use. But that's still work that has to be done. And in terms of negotiations, and we're not in a position now to describe any kind of time frame for that. What's important is that we've taken the oil out of a decaying vessel, one that risks capsizing or exploding at most any moment, frankly. In fact, in 2020, it came very close to that. There was some locally very rapid repairs made underwater to keep it afloat, in fact, at that point in time. So what's important now is that it's out of that decaying tanker into one that's, it's not brand new, but it's built in 2008, so it's much newer, almost 40 years newer. Double hold, modern environmental standards for containing oil. It's in a much better place right now, much more secure than it was before and for a much longer period of time. So now we have time to work out the other issues. And that's the work that's ahead of all of us now. Thank you.
Thanks. Ephraim Kusaivi?
Thank you so much. Mr. Gressly, your optimism and that of Mr. Steiner's is very palpable today. Do you feel that the same optimism is being felt around you in Yemen, among the Yemeni parties, and also the political groundwork that you spoke of and that went into this operation? How much of it do you think could pave the way for further political work and perhaps towards a comprehensive settlement? Thank you.
Well, I'll let Achim also speak on this because I think he would have a clear view on this as well. Yes, it's a Good Friday, so we feel good about what we've seen today. It's nice to see something advance as it did here. In terms of the larger political dialogue, of course, it won't contribute directly to that. But I have to say, monitoring, whether it's the social media domestically, our own conversations, it does create a bit of hope for people that there is a way forward. And while the parties are adversaries, they did find a way to set aside those differences long enough to deal with this particular problem. And that can create, I think, conditions more conducive for negotiations. And also, I think the fact that the MOU that was signed back in March last year that so far has been adhered to by SANA is a good sign that you can have successful negotiations in this context. That does not guarantee it, but it does create a sense of, I think, hope that may not have been there before. And I hope those that are in a position to do so can take advantage of whatever momentum this has created to go forward. But let me stop here and see if Achim, if you want to complement that, I'm sure you have views on this as well. Over to you.
Well, David, I think you have captured it well. I mean, in the larger context of Yemen today, I would call it a glimpse of hope, because it is still one of the most catastrophic humanitarian situations in the world. UNDP, that works in virtually all parts of the country, has estimated that Yemen over the last 8 years has lost somewhere between 20 to 22 years of its development. So I think the context within which this operation had to be mounted was in some ways very particular, quite unique. But I think, as David said, one can at least speculate that the ability of two sides to this conflict who lack trust in each other, who lack confidence in each other, who even are very skeptical towards the international community, found it within themselves, and ultimately with a very strong sense of support from the public, as we learned over the last few months, that this was an operation that was of benefit to every Yemeni citizen and therefore required exceptional and unusual measures. I think, more broadly speaking, we have seen in the last few months changes in the dynamics in the region and within the country. I think for us to extrapolate from that would probably be, as you say, perhaps too optimistic. But I think what we believe as a result of this operation is what we in the United Nations often in some of the most hopeless situations find out is that if you are transparent, an honest broker, that you have patience and you use diplomacy and the convening power of the UN, you can create the space within which even some of the most adversely opposed groups can find common cause. Yemen desperately needs peace. Maybe the FSO Safer and the story of how we got here might actually give some hope to those who believe that there is more that can be achieved in the next few months.
Thank you. Next question goes to Sune Rasmussen from the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So it's two sort of similar questions in one. Assuming that there's still some value in the FSO Safer once it's scrapped, what will happen to the money from the sale of the Safer? And what will happen to the oil? I mean, I realize that it'll be stored for the sort of short term in the FSO Yemen. Is it meant to be, will it be sold? And if it is sold, what will happen to those profits? Or if it's not sold, who will pay for the operation of the FSO Yemen that will store the oil? Thank you.
Hey, Farhan, you allow me to start responding, because I do want to pick up where David also highlighted the fact that the United Nations and UNDP in particular, as the contracting party, is highly exposed right now, because we have made the decision, in part also with the bridging finance for cash flow from our colleagues in OCHA, to not suspend this operation for lack of financing. the pledges that have been secured so far simply are not adequate to cover the costs of the operation. So your question, first of all, in terms of the realization of finance from the scrapping and the recycling of the FSO Safer is indeed a very relevant one, because the price for iron and steel is high at the moment. So we have initiated a procurement process that has received a number of bids, which we are currently evaluating, because we also had to await a concrete date for which we could then commission, first of all, the towing, and then the scrubbing of the vessel in a port, and ultimately its scrapping and recycling. Those funds, and I don't yet want to put a firm figure on it, but it is not insignificant, would go, first of all, towards covering what is currently a deficit, both in terms of the operation so far, where we are meant to rapidly return the bridging finance to OCHA, because there are so many humanitarian priorities at the moment. And secondly, still to complete the phase that involves the procurement of a convoy. So right now, I think it is probably the simplest way of putting it is that the scrapping and recycling will contribute towards the current deficit. In addition to that, we are hoping that others will step forward. And let me also say this very frankly here. I think there are many in the industry that may still seize this moment to step forward where they have not stepped forward so far, and help to close this financing gap. Beyond that, the oil that is currently stored on the Yemen, as David pointed out, proved to be difficult to negotiate in advance a way in which it could ultimately be sold. Here are two parties to this negotiation that need to find a formula, the trust and the confidence to do so. Ultimately, that is our sincere hope, that they will see the rationale and the benefit of doing so, because frankly, as I began my answer to your question, Yemen desperately needs financing in terms of humanitarian support, but also in terms of repair of infrastructure and the kind of development recovery work that UNDP, with the support of the international community, is already, alongside others, implementing right now. So that oil ultimately does belong somewhere else than temporarily stored on a tanker in the Red Sea. Thank you.
Thanks. The next question goes to Iftikhar Ali from the Associated Press of Pakistan.
Thank you, Farhan. My question has just been asked by my colleague from Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions amongst the crowd? If not, I'd like once more to...
Farhan?
Yeah?
Farhan?
Yeah?
It's Maggie. Sorry,
Okay.
could I just jump in and ask either you or Mr. Gressley, could you just confirm that no ransom was paid for the 5 UN staff members who were released? And also, can you give us, maybe you can't give us an exact number, but there remain others who are still being held. Could you just tell us perhaps ballpark how many staff that is and by whom?
On the first question, what I can say is on our policy, and this is what we say in all such situations, as policy, the United Nations never pays ransom. We do not encourage the payment of ransom, since, of course, that would simply place all of our other staff members at risk, and so that's our consistent policy across the board on this. Turn over to Mr. Gressley for anything further on that.
I think I would add to that is absolutely, we do not pay ransom. And that kind of answers one of the questions that was asked earlier, why does it take so long? Because we don't pay ransom. And therefore you need to negotiate on that basis often takes more time, but it protects other UN staff members. And that's the two things we want. We want people to come back home safe, alive. And secondly, we don't want to encourage a pattern that will be repeated with other UN staff members. To answer your question, in Yemen, I don't know outside of Yemen, we have no further staff members being held for ransom or kidnapped at this point in time. We have 2 UN staff currently under detention in Sana'a that have been under detention since November 2021, and we remain concerned about their health and well-being, as well as the need for their release. So that's in terms of Yemen, that's who we were worried about at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you. And a follow-up from Edie.
Just a quick follow-up. You talked about the next step being procurement of a convoy. Could you explain what that means?
You want to
David,
do,
you
you
want
want
to
to
go?
do that? Yeah, I could do that if that's okay. You want? We can send you later what CALM stands for. It's a long title that I never totally remember, but essentially it's a pump. It's a giant buoy that's about 800 tons in size, in weight, and it's designed to pump oil in and out of a pipeline and onto a vessel. So that's, and it's also designed for a vessel to be tethered to it. We did this in this case, for those of you who've seen, the old FSO Safer is currently structurally mounted to the pipeline with a turret that's out in front. We didn't go that way, one, because it's more expensive, and two, it takes many, many months to build, about 18 months. The option we put in place here allowed this to take place this year, not in 2025. So it's extremely important that we do this the way we were doing it. And so the next step is to put that buoy in place, anchor it so that the MT Yemen can be tethered to it as a permanent way of anchoring it there. There is no oil to pump out of the Safer area because that pipeline is in disuse and the oil fields are shut down at this point in time. So it doesn't have any immediate use in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've been informed by one of our helpful colleagues online that CALM is a catenary anchor leg mooring buoy. So a CALM buoy is a catenary anchor leg mooring buoy. Beyond that, there's a hand up from Sune Rasmussen. Is that an old hand, or do you still have a question?
And sorry.
Oh, okay. So I believe that's it for questions then. With that, I would like to thank our guests one more time, Achim Steiner and David Gressley. Thank you very much for this good news and this informative briefing, and have a great weekend.